didn't want to come in, but my boss said that I had to.
Africa, and this is what he said about a generation or 2 generations ago. He said, I have been in this area for a month and have learned a trade language in one area, and in about 3 months I learned a trade language in another area, and I've learned both of these languages to the degree to which I can communicate Christ to these people. Now that sounds extremely encouraging, and indeed I'm sure to him was. However, now about 2 generations later, we have 2 Doctor of Missiology students at Trinity, one of whom has completed a project in which he examines a large evangelical church in his part of sub-Saharan Africa and discovers that that church is shot through and through with witchcraft. And that most Christians will, when they're in a tough spot, visit the pastor, but they will almost invariably visit the shaman to find out what his or her analysis of the problem is. We have another Doctor of Missiology project that is in process, which is doing a statistical analysis of Christianity among the Zulu peoples of South Africa and the impact of Christianity upon these people. And there are 2 populations, the non-Christian Zulu population, the Christian Zulu population, on such questions as, what about the ancestors? Are the ancestors still with us? Do they live with us? Do we live with them? Do we have to take them into account? Do they affect our lives? The non-Christians said, yes, they do, about 80% of them. But the astonishing thing is that 70% of the Christians said the same thing. When the question was asked about the Bible, as to whether or not the Bible was really relevant in terms of today, whether Africans today could take those promises and find them applicable to contemporary life in Africa, almost half of the Christians said no. Now this is 2 generations after that pioneer missionary said, I learned the trade language and I can communicate Christ. Lest someone say, well, this is Africa, or lest someone say, one might do it better through an interpreter. Let me read something from Merrill Abbey's Man, Media, and the Message. This is on page 51, and this comes from the experience of early missionaries among the Patuma people in Suriname. The interpreters through whom they spoke found some of the words of Christian discourse difficult to translate, Abbey says. Unable to find corresponding Patuma terms, they simply repeated these words untranslated, so that in the midst of the interpretation such English words occurred as temptation, wicked, Christmas, conversion, salvation, and the like. These came to be recognized among the Patuma as powerful words. Listeners thus fitted their missionaries' terms into their pre-Christian experience. Certain powerful words in the animistic religion had been used to call down curses on their enemies. Words they could not decode from the missionaries' messages were regarded as having the force of powerful words in the Christian religion. Now, one Patuma explained, a person can go to prayer meeting, kneel behind the one whom he wishes to curse, and while everyone is praying out loud, he can utter those powerful words and thus destroy his enemy. Needless to say, what that Patuma decoded was not what the missionaries on the other side of a cultural divide thought that they had encoded. Behind the statistics that we all read about, and the growth of the church, and the number of conversions and so on, is this problem of how much of the communication, how much of the gospel message has really communicated to these people. So what I'd like to do today is talk about, first of all, the missionary task in terms of a three-cultural model, and then our approach in dealing with that task, and then thirdly, give you an example by referring to the biblical concept of sin. Let's talk about the missionary task then, first of all, in kind of abstract terms. This is really a modification of a diagram by Eugene Nida. Some of you will be familiar with it in one context or another. Let's say that we are members of the square culture, and I have preserved there Dr. Nida's particular configuration. I think he puts us in the square culture for a purpose, but I don't want to, of course, take this out of context and say too much. We hear the message of Christ in our square culture. Sources, Sunday school teachers, preachers, evangelists, parents, whatever. We're the respondents. The message comes to us through these sources. We then become sources, and we give the message, hopefully, to others in our square culture, who then become the respondents. But there's another aspect of this whole process, and that relates, of course, to the biblical culture, because the message that is really Christian is the message that was given by the prophets of the Old Testament, by the apostles in the New Testament, by our Lord himself. In a different cultural situation, we'll just call it the Bible culture. That's quite varied. It could be, for example, the remnant people of Ezra's time, or it could be the people with a Jewish background and culture of Palestine in Jesus' time, or it could be the Greco-Roman world of Paul's ministry. But we'll simply call it the Bible culture. And the message came through sources, prophets, apostles, our Lord himself, in that cultural context, was given to respondents in that cultural context. They, as sources, as respondents, passed on the message under inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But of course, that message is given in meaningful terms, terms meaningful within that particular culture in which it's given. Now, our missionary task is to go to a round culture. Let this represent the respondent culture in some other part of the world. Could be Hong Kong, could be Africa, could be Latin America, or wherever. Our task as missionaries is to go to that culture, to become sources in that culture, give the message to respondents in that culture, so that they might become Christians and in turn become sources within that culture of the Christian message. But we do that with reference to the Bible culture. So we've got a twofold, maybe even a threefold task. What we have to do, first of all, is go to the Bible culture, go to this message, interpret in this context the Christian message, and then, with as little intrusion of our square culture as possible, communicate that message to the round culture. In terms of contextualization, if you're familiar with that term, it means contextualizing a triangular, shall we call it, Christian message in a round culture in such a way that it will be meaningful to them, while decontextualizing the message as far as there may be square culture remnants in it, you see? Because what we're trying to communicate is not our culture, we're trying to communicate, or the message of our culture, we're trying to communicate the message of the triangular culture. You may have some questions there. I think we'll have time to pick them up in just a little while. Let's then talk briefly about how we approach that task. Here at Trinity, indeed at all schools where we take this task seriously, we attempt to get to the triangular culture through our studies in theology, historical theology, biblical languages, the Bible itself. This is a way of getting at the Scripture, separating cultural items from supracultural truths, getting at the principles as opposed to just cultural adaptations and accommodations and applications. For example, when I was small, growing up in the church, I had all sorts of misunderstandings. Some of them have to do with the hymnology, some had to do with the Scriptures themselves. For example, I often wondered what a cross-eyed bear had to do with Christianity, because we often sang about the consecrated cross-eyed bear. And it took some years before I realized that that wasn't the kind of bear that I had thought it was. But much more close to the Christian message was what the pastor said every time we came to communion. He would say something like this, as after the elements had been passed out. Drink ye all of it. Eat ye all of it. Now he always emphasized the all. And yet, what we had to drink came in such a small cup, something about this size. And the bread, as I recollect it, was only about this size. In my immature mind, I often wondered how you could drink any of it without drinking all of it, or how you could eat any of the bread without eating all of it. It seemed to me to be almost indivisible. It was only much later that I discovered the cultural reason for it. You see, I'm sure that many much older than myself had the same misunderstanding. In the culture, of course, in the culture where you have the common cup and where you have the common loaf, this becomes more understandable, because it's not all of it. They would eat all of it. Or if they would eat not all of it, they would have been what they did is take from the common loaf and drink from the real meaning is all of you drink of it. All of you eat of it. That is the heart of the communion message, you see. But because of the cultural difference, that didn't come across. Some of you will recollect that just a week ago, Dr. Long was talking about disciples choosing the apostle in the place of Judas. He reminded us that the key procedure for those days of the church, to choose someone as a chairman of the church, or as a head elder or something like that, and he decided to bring out the dice and throw the dice, decide who the Lord had for us as elder. very short tenure in that church. You see, it's a difference between cultures. And this is, of course, one of the things that we're concerned about in these theological biblical studies. The illustrations that I've given to you are not nearly as difficult as some other possibilities. I'll give you one in just a few minutes. In missiological studies, then, what we do is take that triangular culture message and adapt it to, or learn how we can adapt it to, other cultures. For example, we study the non-Christian religions, not with a view of simply finding out what the non-Christian religions teach, but with a view of taking that into account when we communicate Christ into these cultures. Many examples could be given of the importance of that. You remember, for a matter of fact, just a few weeks ago, wasn't it, in this class that we discussed those early British missionaries to India, and how William Carey and his associates started to translate even one of the epics, the Hindu Ramayana. Now, when this was discovered back in England, they received a very terse letter which said, did we send you to convert the heathen or to be converted by the heathen? Well, you see, they knew why they were studying the Hindu religion. It was to more meaningfully communicate Christ, but that wasn't understood back in England. And many times, the importance of that is not understood today. In cross-cultural communications in Trinity, what we do is look at this in terms of what we call the 7 dimensions of cross-cultural communication. The non-Christian religions would formulate basically what we have in mind when we talk about worldview. For a matter of fact, in many of the secular institutions today, they're talking about worldview instead of religions. Maybe for several reasons. But in any case, that's basic. How do people view the world? How do they view the world in relationship to themselves? How do they view themselves in relation to the world or to the universe? Cognitive process. How do they think? What is their thought process? What is logic for them? What is a logical presentation? Linguistic forms. This is what we usually think of first. The linguistic ways of expressing ideas. Our idea is if we can only learn the language, but we have to remember that behind the language is a worldview. Behind the language is a certain cognitive process. Behavioral patterns, the so-called silent language. Social structures. How does communication travel within the culture? There are superhighways of communication and there are little byroads of communication, and we have to distinguish between them. Media influence. How do the media themselves, whatever media we might use, books, films, sermons, dialogue, conversation, drama, how do these media themselves communicate to the people? And then, of course, motivational resources. What do they feel is important? What do they feel is valuable? And so on. Now, the reason this is arranged this way is because the more culturally distant our circular culture is from us, the more these dimensions impinge upon the message. Let me say that again. If this round culture is greatly different from our own, let's say it's a Hindu culture, Islamic culture. In some ways, the Islamic culture is closer to us because it is monotheistic. In some ways, socially, it's farther from us because it is so exclusivistic. But when we come to these cultures that are very different from our own, the worldview, the cognitive process, the language itself impinges more and more upon our message and makes it more and more difficult to communicate the Christian message in a meaningful way to that particular culture. That's why That's why we have them arranged, these dimensions arranged in this way. Note also that there is no way that the message can be encoded, and get around these dimensions. It has to go through these various dimensions, perhaps not all of them simultaneously, but it has to go through them in order to get to the respondents. You can't go around them. Example, in one of your textbooks you will find a chapter by Dr. Norman Geisler, who was a professor here at Trinity at the time that your book, Theology of Mission, was written and published. Coming at this whole problem from the perspective of a philosopher theologian, he wrestles with the problem of worldview. Now, Dr. Geisler is not a missionary. Dr. Geisler is not expert particularly in communication. That's not his background. Or in linguistics, or in anthropology. He's just coming at it from the perspective of logic and of theology. And what he says is that worldviews are like glasses, and these glasses are glued on. And you can take them off only at the expense of great difficulty and even suffering. Everyone sees the world, everyone hears messages through the perspective of their worldview glasses. The only possible way of communicating with someone who has a different worldview is that they take off their glasses and put on yours, that you take off your glasses and put on theirs, or that you kind of meet halfway and maybe kind of break the glasses and put on one lens of one worldview and the one lens of the other worldview. Well, actually, of course, the real missionary task and the truly missionary capability is to be able to take off the glasses of our worldview and temporarily at least put on theirs so we can see and hear from their perspective and modify the message accordingly. Now, I mention that because that's coming from the perspective of a theologian philosopher, not from the perspective of a communication expert or an anthropologist. Just as a point of logic, Dr. Geisler says, this has to be taken into account if you're truly going to communicate Christ and Christian truth. Let's move to a specific example of how this works. We'll look at it in terms of linguistic form because most of us just think of primarily of language, but then that language we will see will reflect a worldview. Let me take the New Testament concept of sin. Obviously, if we're going to communicate the Christian message, we have to communicate something about sin. This has to do with our need for salvation, our need for redemption. Now, as we study New Testament Greek, as we study the New Testament, as we study theology, we'll come in contact with this teaching that we now take from the Greek word hamartia. We call it technically hamartiology, the theology of sin, the doctrine of sin. Now, in that triangular culture, it was possible, talking about the New Testament era now, it was possible to employ various words for sin. For example, any of you who have read the Greek classics will be very familiar with the fact that you come into contact with the word adikia, over and over again. That word could have been employed. In fact, it is employed somewhat. Another possible word would be kakia, evil. Another would be anomia, lawlessness. Now, the fact is that these words are used, but the primary word that is used in the New Testament is the word hamartia. Why? Well, Archbishop Trench says this was the word of largest reach. This was the word that had the least amount of cultural meaning already infused into it. So that you could put Christian theology, you could put Christian hamartiology into this word that really simply means to miss the mark, to be off target. And this indeed is the word that was employed. It's almost devoid of ethical, moral, and spiritual meaning. It's the word of largest reach. Therefore, it's invested with this supracultural meaning. Because you see, any word that's employed, if it's going to be used in a Christian sense, probably has to, first of all, be emptied of much of its cultural content before it can be infused with new content and with new meaning. This was the word. While hamartema is never regarded as sinfulness or as the act of sinning, but only sin contemplated in its separate outcomings and deeds of disobedience to a divine law. Do you see what he's saying? He's saying that there's another word that is closely allied with this word, hamartema, which might have been used except for the fact that this word lends itself to concrete and abstract usage. In other words, sin and the act of sinning, not just the sins themselves. You get the difference? This is extremely important. It sounds like a very, very technical point. But Trench reminds us that when there was that important Pelagian controversy in the early centuries, and when the Pelagians said something like, well, how about Chrysostom? Chrysostom said that children are free from hamartia. It was at that juncture that Augustine stood up. Augustine was, by the way, a rhetorician. He was well trained in the use of words and so on. And he got up and he quoted Chrysostom exactly. And he said, oh no, Chrysostom did not say that children were free from hamartia. He said that children were free from hamartema, or the plural, hamartemata. So that while children have not perhaps actually committed sins, you wouldn't hold them guilty of sins. Nevertheless, they are not free from sin. You see the difference? Just a slight change of words? Oh no. A change upon which this whole controversy hinged at that point in the discussion. But now, all of that you get in historical theology, in your linguistic studies, studies of language, Greek, biblical studies, and so forth, don't you? Don't you? Okay. Some don't. But those are the sorts of things that we're dealing with in these studies. Now, let's come to North American English. How do we translate this? Well, adikia would be injustice. Kakia would be evil. Anomia, lawlessness. Hamartia we translate as sin. Now, what's happening in our culture? Do you notice what's happening? Linguistic usage is changing. One of our prominent psychologists, not a believer, has written a book entitled Whatever Became of Sin. You hardly ever use the word sin anymore except in a Christian context, except in a theological context. And even there, increasingly the emphasis is upon adikia rather than hamartia. Read liberal theology, read contextualized theology, read liberation theology. Where is the emphasis? The emphasis is upon injustice and the fact that our task is to somehow address ourselves to the injustice in the world. Whereas the New Testament emphasis is upon hamartia, the fact that we have all missed the mark, that we have missed the road, that we have missed the way. So that even in our culture, this has to be taken into account. But now let's go to another culture. Let's go to Japanese culture. I'll never forget when I introduced one of our workers at a church that we were building to the church program. Asked him if he would like to come to some of our services. His response was, first of all, to laugh, and then to say, what do you think I am, a criminal? Now, he had gotten the notion that, you see, Christians are always talking about sin, sin, sin. But sin in Japanese can be translated various ways, but the primary word that has been adopted is tsumi. Now, tsumi is made up of two Chinese characters, and it comes out of it's derived from the word tsusushimi, or imprudence. This top character means pictures a net. This bottom character pictures the evil, or the person of evil. So tsumi means someone who has done something and has gotten caught in what he has done, and by Japanese thought process, everyone who is guilty of tsumi is a tsumi bito, that is this with the character for person, and should be in prison. You don't have tsumi bito out running around. If they've done something wrong and they've gotten caught in it, then they are incarcerated. Now that's the cultural thinking behind here. What is really involved is that they've done something wrong and they've been stupid enough to get caught in it. And as a result, they are tsumibito. It's not just that they have transgressed some divine law or some universal law, or even just a natural law, but also that they have brought shame upon themselves and shame upon their family or whatever. So it's the shame of being caught in that which is not approved by society. Now let me ask you, does that measure up with the Christian concept of sin, with the New Testament concept of hamartia? You see, how does that compare with what you are taught in theology when you discuss hamartiology? Let me take you to a society that is perhaps even further away. The Sunufo speaking people of the Ivory Coast. Here, the word that is translated sin is kapini. Now, kapini has two basic meanings. One is sins, and the other is taboo. Sins include such things as adultery, stealing, lying, and so on. Taboos include such things as seeing one's wife sewing, hearing one's wife sing the marriage song, or hearing the song of a certain bird after sundown. Now, these are taboos. Now, the interesting thing is that among the Sunufos, These are fairly important. These are somewhat bad. These are really bad. If these happen, they have to be taken care of, and taken care of right away, otherwise you're in real trouble. Now, you and I go from Deerfield to the Ivory Coast, and we are going to preach to the Sunufo-speaking people. And we say, I have good news for you. Christ died for our Kapini. Is that right? Is that really? When I hear my wife singing a marriage song, will Christ take care of that? Well, you see, this is a total inversion of what we really mean. Because we don't think of these taboos. In fact, if you were the ordinary audience, you would laugh at these. Hearing a certain song after sundown, birds sing a certain song, that's really bad? That's sinful? Why, of course not. Hearing one's wife sing the marriage song? Of course not. Seeing one's wife sewing is really bad? Of course not. Christ died for these? Of course not. But that's what Kapini is. Now look, you might say, well, all we have to do is convince them that these aren't bad, that these are really bad, and that this is what Christ died for. Are these hamartemata, or are these hamartia? Because you see, what Christ died for is not just our sins, the separate outcropping of our sinfulness, but for the fact that we indeed are sinners. He was made sin for us. And it's sinfulness that's the problem. It's our rebelliousness that's the problem. Not just the fact that we have committed this or that sin. So you can see the problem that is involved, first of all, in taking this New Testament concept, this biblical concept, and without allowing our understanding to intrude, to take it either to a Japanese culture or to a Sunufo-speaking culture in Ivory Coast. That's the task of cross-cultural communication. And we often trip up at both points. I was going to mention in this context the problem that we have, for example, with that passage in 1 Thessalonians 3, 1 John 3. You remember? He that is born of God does not commit sin, and he cannot sin because his seed remains in him. What do we do with that? Well, you have to look in the context. Up in the 3rd, 4th, 5th verses, it tells about what kind of sin it's talking about. Sin is lawlessness. The word there is anomia. And the sin that the Christian does not commit because he's born of God is the sin of lawlessness. Doesn't mean that we will never stumble. Doesn't mean that we will never lie. Doesn't mean that we will never have an evil thought. What it means is that the one who is truly a Christian will never say that Christ does not have the authority to rule my life. He is not Lord. I'm a law to myself. So that even in our own culture, you see, we can become confused here. And then, what about the confusion that we entail over here, unless, indeed, we are alive to cultural differences and accommodate those differences? Well, let's go back to our original illustration then, and then take some questions. We ordinarily think, you see, that when we preach the message, when we teach the message of Christ, two possible things can result. Either people can be converted and become Christians, which means that they will discard the old beliefs and the old worldview, and so on, and accept the Christian worldview, or they can reject the message, which means that they will keep their old belief, their old faith, and reject the Christian faith, the Christian teaching. But as a matter of fact, there are other possibilities. For example, many times they might discard the old beliefs without really accepting the Christian belief. That way they become secularists. Their old religion, their old what we would call superstitions, these are gradually put away. But at the same time, they do not really, you see, accept Christianity. So they discard the old, but they also reject the new. And they are made into secularists. There's another possibility, and that's where we began our lecture today, and that is syncretism. The greater likelihood is that these people will retain the old and incorporate the new materials into their old system. That's how the Patuma Christians took these so-called powerful words and used them in a pagan way. That was syncretism. Likewise, you see, with that portion of the church which was studied in connection with witchcraft in Zaire, and that study which is currently underway in terms of the Zulu worldview, and whether Christians among the Zulus have really adopted a Christian teaching, or whether they are functioning more as syncretists. This accounts for the fact that while we have 16 to 20,000 new converts in sub-Saharan Africa every day, we also have some 5 to 6 to 7,000 nativistic groups that have formed in Africa around native leaders. And all of these, or most of these, are avowedly syncretistic, keeping the old pagan ideas and also incorporating some Christian ideas. It's to avoid that we study the relationship between culture and communication. Well, maybe you have some questions. Yes?
On the example of the super people, would it be better to use a neutral word rather than
Okay. Would it be better to use a neutral word when translating sin into Japanese or into Sunufo, rather than to use tsumi or to use kapini? Yes and no. This is the old problem that the missionaries faced when they had to translate God. You see, do you employ a word that's already used and then infuse it with new meaning? Or do you try to do you coin a word and put meaning into that word? You run risks any way you do it. The New Testament, Paul tended to use those words, but get as neutral a word as possible, or at least infuse it with new meaning immediately. And therefore you have use of words like mysterion, you have use of pleroma, tsumi, and so on. These words that could be used in another way, indeed, but were immediately infused with new meaning and constantly infused with new meanings. If you employ a totally new word, technically a neologism, in other words, you make up a word, and then you run the risk, for example, among the Patuma, of having another powerful word. Say, we don't know this word at all, but it obviously is a very important word. It can be used in such and such a way, and that is interpreted according to the old worldview. So you run a risk in either way. The problem for most of us will not be which word will we use. Most of us will already discover that the word has been picked for us. For example, we go to either of these cultures, we'll find out that they use kapini in the one case, tsumi in the other. Now, however, the problem is that we recognize that it's not a one-to-one correlation. That hamartia is not sin, and that sin English now, sin is not necessarily tsumi, is not necessarily kapini. All of these have their cultural characteristics and their cultural meanings. And indeed, these might change over a period of time. So we have to be alive to what sin is in our culture. We have to be alive to what tsumi is in Japanese culture, and so on. Another question over here. Yes?
How do you ferret out all these differences in the worldview?
First of all, by getting at them in kind of a macrocosmic sense. That is, there are, let's say, 7 or 8 major religions in the world. Now, there's a sense in which there are scores, even hundreds. But if you take them down to their roots, to their sources, there are comparatively few fundamentally different religions, fundamentally different worldviews in the world. So you can examine those. So you have non-religious worldviews, you have religious worldviews. Among non-religious worldviews, you mainly have secularism, materialism, naturalism. Among religious worldviews, you would have theistic worldviews, monotheistic worldviews, pantheistic worldviews, monistic worldviews, and so on, which accounts for Hinduism, for Christianity, for Islam, and so on, the major religions. By looking at it this way, it becomes entirely manageable. And then gradually, of course, you build upon that knowledge. Maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Yes?
I'm not sure about the exact wording, but I think Paul said something expressing the idea that he became all things to all men that he might win the more to Christ. When he did that, what became of Paul? You know, Paul starts out, and as he goes from each place to each place, having to change in order to meet the needs of that particular place. What's a solid footing? How can he, and then does he take in things that could be bad, or could they be bad seen only in the sense of possibly the next place he might go to?
No, you had a good illustration of that in Dr. Longmaker's lectures a week, 10 days ago, in the Ram lectures, when he followed Paul through his missionary journeys and talks about him preaching in different contexts, and then the letters going to churches in different contexts. So, for example, when he goes to Antioch in Pisidia, in the synagogue, he starts where those people are. They're familiar with this Old Testament history and so on, so he can begin there. When he is in Lystra, he starts where they are, which is basically an animistic worldview, many gods and so on, you see. But and when he is in Athens, he begins where they are, which is a much different situation where philosophy has dealt with these materials and so on. But he begins with the unknown God, and then he works through some of their philosophical approaches and so on. In each case, he's given
sees other sources in some parts of Jewish liturgy. I'm not really an expert in that myself. But of course, the beauty and brilliance of the Lord's Prayer is the combination of things and the totality.
Because we, in Christian circles, we recognize the fact that the words that are there are not supposed to be just something you repeat, although that's what's done on Sunday morning is you repeat that, but those that understand it properly understand that it's basically just an outline of how you should pray to God.
Oh, I see.
And that's why I wondered if...
As an outline.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if Matthew
had
when
some
Christ
other
gave
structure.
it to us, whether they would understand, the Jews of the time would understand it as the key words in a liturgy at the time.
We, as kind of an outline of a service,
Mhm.
it's a very good question. I don't know enough to answer that.
Okay.
It's a very interesting idea.
Good thesis project.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Are you interested in liturgy yourself?
I'm interested in finding out Hebrew forms of worship and how Christians can learn from that, how to adore and praise and relate to
That's
God.
wonderful.
So that's the area of interest.
Well, I think that's I've burdened you enough with enough detail tonight. If you're interested, of course, there's a huge literature on Jewish liturgy, and there must be a very large literature, I know there is, on, well, obviously early Christian liturgy and the relations. Be happy to help you if you're ever interested. What stage of your studies are you in?
Last year,
Are you working on a thesis?
no, I'm on the MDiv program.
Oh, I see.
The thesis is not required, but it's something that I might stick in my little bag, pull out someday.
Okay. Thank you for coming out. I enjoyed meeting with you. Okay.
Do you have more time? I have a couple questions from last.
Oh,
last
sure.
time we met.
Of course I do.
I was just wondering, from the things we discussed last time, the concept of immortality. You know, you had mentioned last time that there were different concepts. Some people think that it ends, at least that's the impression I got, that there were those that thought that
There
you
are
were going to
Jews, there are Jews who, basing themselves on the thesis that the Hebrew Bible has no specific reference, and that can be debated. It's very debatable, but you know, it's a position. That the Hebrew Bible does not emphasize immortality, that they can be Jews and not have a doctrine of immortality. Now, I'm just saying that that's possible, and we would not say you can't be Jewish with that idea. Most Jews do believe that there is immortality of the soul. I'm going to come to another point in a minute. Now, what form that takes, whether an identity is preserved,